Hey guys, it's been a while. So you may recall about a year ago I did a video titled 14 extremely dark and disturbing horror and thrillers that I've watched. So I figured why not revisit the topic. So extreme horror or extreme cinema. To me, in my own interpretation, these are films that have prolonged or excessive acts of violence, gore, taboo practices, bodily fluids are involved. You could also include splatter and exploitation films into this category. It's the type of niche subset that's banned by mainstream media, and the type of films, like I said, that are prolonged in mutilations, humiliation, and deterioration of its victims. First film that I'm going to be talking about is 2009's Melancholie der Engel, or The Angel's Melancholia, directed by Marian Dora, who's a controversial director. I've watched another one of his films that I'm going to be talking about later on. You have two sadistic friends named Katze and Broth, please correct me if I mispronounce that, who basically have a group of people in tow. They spend their last days at this old house. This film has quite a bit in terms of mediophilia, coprophilia, europhilia, which just culminates in shock value content. That's really how I could describe this movie. It runs for nearly 3 hours, which was a lot to get through. While I can give credit and praise to Marian Dora for the cinematography work, because I think he should actually go into like directing music videos, because the film, and another one that I watched as well from him, it has a very, how would I describe it? A very like fever dream sort of feel to it. Prolonged imagery of the macabre in the house, which made me think of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But it's also riddled with this pseudo-philosophical dialogue between the two male characters. There is an excessive amount of animal cruelty that's not simulated. And if you know me, how I personally feel about animal cruelty in horror films, just gonna leave it at that. There is an eye roll there. And that's another flaw with this film, is while there is religious subtext involved, it's easily lost with its convoluted plot, or lack thereof. Easily Clarissa, I think she's a character that I felt the worst for. I felt really bad for her just because she is wheelchair bound, and the extreme forms of torture, punishment that they put her through, and her death, it was really sad. I don't have a general like overall scope, optical view of like what it all means. What is the intention? I know that it's a very nihilistic film, but it also made me think of Freud's idea of the id, ego, and superego, because these people, yeah, they just let their id take over. Their impulses, the most disgusting forms of human depravity. I'm not going to go into detail with what they do. You could look up this film if you have that morbid curiosity. Now I'm going to do something a little bit different with each film. So basically I'm going to categorize, did I find the movie disturbing? Did I find it overhyped? Or is it in the null or void? Needless to say, I'm going to say it's overhyped. Like even the shocking moments, it just felt like it kept dragging on, or I just felt really numb to it, if that makes sense. There's nothing of value there. There's nothing that I really took away from the experience other than feeling annoyed that I spent nearly 3 hours trying to get through that film, and it just, like I said, felt very pretentious. Yeah, I pretty much have nothing else to say about Melancholie der Engel. I will not watch that movie again. Let's move on from that movie. And now we're going to be talking about The Bunny Game. This is also an experimental film directed by Adam Raimier. It's shot entirely in black and white, and it had a budget of $13,000. This film involves a hitchhiking prostitute who basically gets a ride from this unhinged truck driver and is put through hell. So the film opens up with Bunny, the female lead, that's what she's titled as, giving a client fellatio, which is not simulated. That's something that I really wanted to point out, is the acts of torture, like Hog, the truck driver, that's what he's titled as, branding the victim, this female character, it's all real. But truthfully, something that surprised me about this movie is that I was going in expecting a blood-soaked film, and instead it's a movie that revels more in the sadomasochistic torture and psychological destruction of this woman. But with that said, the most nauseating part for me would have to be the video editing coupled with the score of the film. or soundtrack, and also the screaming that's all meshed together. It feels like a total assault on the senses. Like I said, there are things to be appreciated about this movie, such as the fact that it was filmed, each scene was filmed in one take, so I can appreciate that. But it teeters on the line of just being a little bit dull and boring. Like there's something, an element that's missing to make me really kind of like, okay, it stands out a bit. So while I didn't loathe it like Melancholy or ENGEL, I wasn't disturbed by it. But I wouldn't necessarily say it's like really overhyped. For me, this film would just go in the null. I'm just going to put it in the void because I really don't know how to feel about the bunny game. It exists.
Next on Six Ed World.
2015's Headless. This is a horror slasher that's directed by Arthur Kolfer. It's one of those B-rated slasher films that has some interesting ideas, but it never culminates into anything satisfying. I will give it praise though for its practical effects and its carnage. Then it takes it a step further. This movie basically involves a mass killer who performs murder, necrophilia, cannibalism, and by taking it a step further, I mean, and I'm going to be a little bit more descriptive, so trigger warning if you don't want to hear this, but basically he gratifies himself by killing his victims, decapitating them, and thus having sex with decapitated heads.
Yeah.
While it's an interesting psychoanalytical look into the psyche, mind of this killer who, by the way, the movie is set in 1978, but it goes through these flashbacks of his mistreatment by his abusive mother and sister, which is actually incestual. And he's followed by this, what I presume to be his figment of his imagination, this character called Skullboy. This movie is supposed to pay homage to those kind of grimy, sleazy grindhouse type films. While it doesn't have the mega production or it's not filled with like a star-studded cast, I can appreciate what went into making this film. It's just sometimes I felt kind of lost watching this movie just because it felt really disjointed. Like the timeline of the events, specifically Jess, that character, her plot line, this girl who's working this dead-end job and she's surrounded by these like stereotypical losers around her. It's pretty obvious and evident like the way the film is progressing, what's going to happen. I wasn't attached to any of the characters. The acting is questionable at best, but I can still praise or give praise to the practical effects. For this one, I don't know. I think I didn't really find it disturbing. I found it more comedic, even though there are some really sick and nasty parts. I didn't find it disturbing. I don't think it's overhyped though, because this is not a movie that I see really talked about. I'm gonna put it in horror limbo. But next we have one that you've probably heard of, and that is the August Underground trilogy. But for this video, I'm just going to be talking about the first one, so August Underground, which came out in 2001, and it's directed by Fred Vogel. This is a faux snuff, found footage type horror movie involving two friends who document their crimes via a camcorder. Something about this movie that I found really interesting was the juxtaposition with the crimes that they're committing, the imagery involved, and how heinous it is, yet these two individuals are jesting, laughing obnoxiously, and enjoying like the deplorable acts that they're committing, which made me think of, I felt like I was watching an episode of Jackass, which is a weird comparison to make, but they just kept laughing and they're very infantile-like or childlike. Believe it or not, I actually really enjoyed August Underground, which I feel like a sicko just saying that, but I actually did. I thought it was a well put together film. I don't know how else to state that without having like any weird looks. Now, Mortem is a different story. Watch that one. I have a different opinion on that one. And Penance is also a different opinion on that one as well. They're all like, basically someone on, what was it, Letterboxd kind of described it perfectly. Same shit, different toilet. Basically. Similar acts of violence. Some of them take it a step further than others. For example, Mortem, I think, was probably the most depraved, went into levels that there's a specific scene involving maggot in that one. But the third one, I think, had the best as far as gore effects. Since it is found footage and I'm biased to that, it feels like a very low production made film, which it is. but it felt very realistic in certain parts. But at no point I'm like, they don't get caught. They're so stupid. They're bumbling idiots. I'm like, how are they getting away with the crimes that they're committing? Something that I also want to point out with these type of movies is that they don't want you to miss an ounce of the bodily fluids. I don't know what is the obsession with a lot of these extreme horror movies. For some reason, there's like a big obsession with smearing feces, which you'll see it's a common thread with the next movie I'll be talking about. Just defecation in general. There's like a big obsession with that, and just the over-sexualization and objectification of women. That seems to be something that's prevalent in these movies, which something I took note of that I was like, all right, I see like a very common theme or common thread of what these movies entail. This one might be surprising, but I'm going to put it in overhyped. And the reason, and I think those two things can coincide. So I can still enjoy the film, but think it's an overhyped film just because I see this one constantly on the list. Like, this is one of the most disturbing movies. It's a really extreme horror film. As far as the first one, yeah, I didn't really get that vibe. I wasn't really shaken up by it. So that's where I'm going to place this one. But next we're going to move on to 2015's Atroz, aka Atrocious. So this film involves a commander and police officers who arrest a serial killer after a car crash, only to discover gruesome footage via videotapes. It's directed by Lex Ortega and produced by Ruggero Deodato of Cannibal Holocaust, featuring some extreme taboos. So mutilations, dismemberment, beatings, excretion of various bodily fluids, incest, rape, reassigned genitals. Now, this is one of those films that has that traditional filmmaking approach coupled with found footage with the tapes that are discovered, but it's also a movie that I think highlights some important ideas such as toxic masculinity. There's definitely objectification of women. There's also homophobia involved with young Goyo and his father, who discovers homoerotic material, and some really brutal scenes that occur afterwards. I think the most disturbing part, aside from the cross-dressing prostitute, which you see in the first part of the film, in the tapes, and then what happens to Jenny, really messed up as well. But for me, once we get to, I think, the third tape, where we get a little bit more of a backstory into Goyo, the serial killer, and how he became who he is, I feel like it's one of those movies that just keeps going with each level of just depravity. For example, the first tape with the cross-dressing prostitute reminded me so much of August Underground. And so I wonder if this film was inspired by that, because the character, I believe her name was Lisa, the girl that was tied up in the basement in August Underground. Very similar feel to what was going on in this film with the first tape. But for me, like I was saying, the most disturbing part of this movie, and I will say I thought it was disturbing because it's what he does when he drugs his parents and what happens afterwards, and like the slew of violence and nastiness. I'm just going to start calling, like, this title for this video is going to be Filthcore. There's a certain POV of something being inserted. Yeah. If you watch this movie, you already know what I'm talking about. I'm not going to describe that. And then my biggest pet peeve with this movie would be the editing, or like the overuse of glitch effects and static with the found footage that's discovered. It just felt like they were trying too hard to make it this piece of like real material, raw footage. So for this one, I'm actually going to say that it's disturbing. Like, looking at the overall quality of it, it's kind of just hard to look at that, just because I keep taking snippets from it, like that specific scene that I was actually talking about for a moment, without getting too descriptive. This one actually was one of the ones that just stuck with me after I watched it, and I was telling Blair about it, like, you won't believe what I just watched. With that said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I know it was a lot heavier on the material that we're discussing, but comment down below. Let me know if there's like a film that falls under the extreme cinema category that you'd like me to discuss, because I've got quite a few that I've watched already, a handful under my belt that I'm willing to talk about. I feel like I barely scratched the surface with these films. This is just like a part one. Unlike last time with my last video, I've watched those films or rewatched them consecutively. This time I'm just kind of spreading it out because I've noticed that last time I felt really crappy. And so I think that goes without saying that consuming this much content, this type of heavy content, at a certain point I want to watch something else. Something maybe a little bit more lighthearted. Let me know if you guys want me to discuss any other extreme horror films again, and I will catch you guys soon. Bye guys.